Good morning, Europe. Welcome to the program. Our top stories for you this hour. Friends or foes? Donald Trump calls the EU a foe of the US, even putting it before traditional rivals Russia and China. Watching with unease. Trump's comment comes ahead of his first official summit with Vladimir Putin, a meeting that's making allies nervous. Wild celebrations in the streets of France as the team bring home a second World Cup title. Plus, over in the Cube, our social media news desk.
Yes, there were those celebrations, but there's also looting in Lyon and tear gas on the streets as elements turn violent.
Sharing the burden, Italy allows 450 migrants to land in Sicily after 5 countries agreed to share the burden. As Europe struggles to cope, we bring you our exclusive documentary from on board the Aquarius. Mourning a hero, the Thai boys and their coach rescued from a cave were finally told that a rescue diver had died during the rescue mission. Thank you for starting your Monday morning with us. Our top story this hour. All eyes are on U.S. President Donald Trump as he rounds off his European tour in Helsinki with a highly anticipated U.S.-Russia summit. Well, no one knows exactly what he will discuss with his Russian counterpart, and Trump says he has, quote, low expectations for the talks. What is certain is that the trip so far has not been without controversy. In a CBS interview ahead of the summit, Trump indicated that the European Union might be public enemy number one. Well, at least as far as trade is concerned.
Well, I think we have a lot of foes. I think the European Union is a foe, what they do to us in trade. Now, you wouldn't think of the European Union, but they're a foe. Russia's a foe in certain respects. China's a foe economically, certainly. They're a foe. But that doesn't mean they're bad. It doesn't mean anything. It means that they're competitors.
Well, European leaders and commentators have been quick to react and respond to Trump's choice of words, using the word foe there. Alex in the Cube has more on this.
It's a strong word, isn't it, Tessa? I mean, What a word to use on your visit to Europe, the US president wanting an easy time. Well, that word foe has been seized on, but it's worth noting that the interview Donald Trump was giving went on a little further than the clip perhaps everyone's playing. Let's just pull up, though, that first comment from the president. It is true, he said, beg your pardon. Let's pull up the first quote the president showed. Well, I think we have a lot of foes. I think the European Union is a foe, what they do to us in trade. But then, as we have next, he did go on to say that his mum was from Scotland. He has his family are from Europe, and he goes to say, I love those countries. I respect the leaders of those countries. But in a trade sense, they are totally taking advantage of us. So a lot of people online pointing out there's a slight nuance to this use of the word foe. It hasn't stopped a lot of people commenting on the use of that particular term, though, including Donald Tusk, president of the European Council, tweeting that America and the EU are best friends. And then he turns a phrase of Donald Trump's on its head, saying anybody else saying anything else is spreading fake news. In the last hour, Donald Tusk has tweeted again ahead of a EU meeting in Beijing and this meeting in Helsinki to say it is the duty of world leaders, EU leaders and the US president meeting with Russia to uphold the world order. And look at this last line here, a not so subtle dig at the president. I hope this message reaches Helsinki. Well, there's been a lot of comments. First of all, journalists pointing out that when asked about foes, Donald Trump pointed out the EU first, as Bloomberg pointed out. That was before Russia and China, the historical opponents. Brian Klaas, the academic, saying that if you just look at what Donald Trump has done through Europe, he has threatened to pull out of NATO. He has questioned the role of NATO. He's brought the UK government to a cliff, according to Brian, and now he has praised Vladimir Putin. And he, Brian, says all of this is on Putin's wish list. But let's not forget that for other people, they're pointing out that Donald Trump is talking about trade. He is standing up for America's interest in the eyes of his base in the face of the EU. So what do you think? Is Donald Trump fair? Is these choice of words being blown out of proportion? You can let us know your thoughts using #TheCube.
All right, thanks for that, Alex. In the meantime, Trump has so far refused to say whether or not he will be discussing alleged Russian election meddling during the 2016 U.S. campaign. But there are plenty of other topics for the two leaders to talk about at their first summit, as Evelyn Laverick reports.
President Donald Trump arrived in Helsinki, playing down his expectations for his summit with President Vladimir Putin. Admittedly, they have a lot to get through, including the elephant in the room, Russian meddling in the 2016 presidential election.
I don't expect anything. I frankly don't expect. I go in with very low expectations. I think that getting along with Russia is a good thing, but it's possible we won't.
Trump was also asked at the pre-summit interview if he would be demanding that the indicted Russian spies be handed over for allegedly hacking into the Democratic Party's computers.
Well, I might. I hadn't thought of that, but certainly I'll be asking about it. But I think the DNC should be ashamed of themselves for allowing themselves to be hacked.
That's perhaps a no, then. This will be the third time the two leaders have met, and an upbeat Putin team says they regard Trump as a negotiating partner. But there are concerns that he might give away more than he gets back. Syria is a point in question. President Bashar al-Assad's victory in the 7-year civil war appears imminent, thanks in no small part to Putin.
What Trump really wants in Syria is ISIS to be defeated and Iran will be kept out of the Syria. So he won't mind very much if Assad remains as a controller of the situation on the ground.
And then there's Ukraine. The US said it would never recognize the Russian annexation of the Crimean Peninsula, but is Trump having second thoughts? He said it might as well belong to Russia, as the majority of people there speak Russian. The summit is only scheduled to last 4 hours, long enough for both anti-Trump and Putin demonstrators to make their feelings clear. Whatever other issues crop up, Trump is sticking to his style of diplomacy, believing one-on-one meetings are the way to get things done. Evelyn Laverick, Euronews.
Well, let me just bring you some top lines coming out from Russia. The RIA news agency quoting a Kremlin spokesman saying that the Putin-Trump discussions on Syria could be difficult given the U.S.'s view on Iran, and that they hope that the summit will be some kind of step away from current crisis in relations. So that's the latest lines we're getting out of there. Now, NBC News' Cal Perry is in Helsinki for the summit, and he is joining me now live. Cal, let's look at the American perspective here. What are they hoping to get out of this summit?
You know, what's interesting is when it comes to this U.S. president, it's almost the moment itself that he most cherishes from these events, whether it's these G7s, whether it's with Kim Jong-un, or, for example, when those American hostages came back to the United States from North Korea. It's those television moments that he really goes for. Never before has the U.S. ever entered a summit with the Soviets or the Russians in places like Helsinki where there's been nothing stated on the agenda and no real indication that the U.S. president has prepared for this summit. So while there are a never-ending list of incredibly important issues that should be brought up, the annexation of Crimea, Syria, the aforementioned Russian meddling in the U.S. elections, it's not clear what will be brought up, partly because there will be nobody else in the room when President Putin and President Trump have their one-on-one. So this president, in keeping sort of with what we've seen in the last year and a half in dismantling these democratic institutions, he's also dismantled the U.S. State Department, which has led us to this point where we're on the eve, we're on the morning of a summit, of an incredibly historic meeting, and we don't know what's on the agenda, and we don't know what the Americans really are going for, Tessa.
Indeed, a lot of questions there. Thank you very much, Cal Perry, there in Helsinki. Well, the fact that the summit is even happening is being seen by some as already a geopolitical win for Putin. And to talk more about this, I'm joined by Galina Polonskaya, also in Helsinki. Galina, we were just hearing some top lines coming out of Russia on what the Russian side hopes to get out of the summit. Can you tell us more about their expectations?
Well, actually, the major expectations of Russia is to see today that Putin made Russia great again. You know, when Donald Trump came to the White House, it was hard to predict for Vladimir Putin, of course, that it would take him 1.5 years to get to this bilateral meeting. But I think that it was worth waiting, and this moment could not even be better. The World Cup, it was very successful. It has finished yesterday, and the world apparently liked it. And there is a new wave of patriotism arising in Russia. So now, today, Vladimir Putin will show that he is respected on the international political agenda, and that could be one of his major goals. On the other hand, Russian people seem to be tired and seem to be skeptical about solving the international issues now. What they want from Putin is to concentrate on the domestic problems, the retirement age and the pensions, for example. But even those who believe that Russia is a besieged fortress and US is an enemy, they do consider that some constructive dialogue and some kind of deals on something could help Russia save some money to solve domestic problems. Well, some skeptical analysts, as you've mentioned, think that and this summit will have no concrete results at all. But when I've asked Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov in February, when this meeting was far from being predicted, was there any hope in Donald Trump left, he said that what is important is the pragmatism, and Putin today apparently will put on the table some concrete proposals to revive the business relationships between the two countries.
All right, thank you very much for that, Galina Polonskaya in Helsinki there. Thank you. And still to come for you on Good Morning Europe, a night of celebrations as France clinch their second World Cup win. We'll be crossing live to Paris. Plus, British Prime Minister Theresa May has told Brexiteers that within her government to support her plans or, quote, risk no Brexit at all. A correspondent in London will tell us what to expect this week. But first, let's take a short break. Welcome back to Good Morning Europe. Your top story, U.S. President Donald Trump calls the EU a foe before also listing China and Russia as enemies. Well, this comes ahead of Trump's first summit with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Both sides say they have low expectations. Well, street parties have erupted across France as expected as they take home their second World Cup title. In a stunning victory, Les Bleus beat Croatia 4-2, 20 years after they won their first star. Euronews' Paul Rees has this story.
A whistle blows in Moscow and all of Paris erupts in celebration. 20 years after France won the World Cup on their own soil, the trophy will come home again, after Les Bleus beat Croatia 4-2 in Russia.
The best in the world! The best in the world!
Ils ont trop bien joué, c'était parfait. Trop contente, trop contente.
On a gagné, et ça, on l'a fait avec le cœur, parce que nous, on est déterminés, et on l'a fait. Merci la France!
Tens of thousands gathered on the Champ de Mars on one of the hottest days of the year. Their dreams immediately got closer to reality as France took the lead. Before Croatia's equaliser dampened the mood again. After that, though, the goals kept going in for France despite a late slip. The end of 90 minutes sealing a 4-2 win. And ending 2 decades of ups and downs since France were last world champions, including the notorious players' strike at the World Cup in 2010 that left fans alienated. Supporters very much back in love with the team now.
It's been a stormy 20 years for France at the World Cup. The storms didn't end with this most extraordinary final, but the trophy will be coming back to Paris, carried by a team that joins the greats of the game of football. Paul Rees, Euronews, Paris.
Well, we saw all the celebrations there, but we also have reaction from Croatia. Euronews journalist Beatrix is in Zagreb. Beatrix, of course, France's win is Croatia's loss. Can you tell us what the mood is like there now?
The atmosphere is absolutely fantastic. Croatians say they did not lose the gold, they won the silver. So they're absolutely satisfied and happy with the result being the second best in the world. And the party was going on till very early in the morning, and actually it's still going on because Croatia is preparing to welcome the team this afternoon. So we are in Jelačić Square, which is the main square in Zagreb. TV crews are already here, and some fans, some enthusiastic fans are already here to have the best place in the square to see the team as they arrive, and they can welcome them. So the atmosphere is just simply fantastic, even in the morning.
Oh, that's fantastic news to know that they are still very positive despite their loss. That's Beatrix Asboth there in Zagreb. Well, I think now we can cross live to our correspondent who is in Paris, Paul Rees. Can you hear me? Paul, there you are. So you have been witnessing the amazing celebrations there in Paris. Can you tell us all about that? It was an emotional roller coaster.
Anyone's really seen a World Cup final like it. The celebrations really started early yesterday. Thousands and thousands of people, tens of thousands of people here on the Champ de Mars. All this area behind me, which is empty now, thronged with French supporters. And it really was a joyful occasion. And the second half, so many goals going in. Despite that late slip by the captain, Hugo Lloris, to let in a second Croatian goal, there was just so much joy here, and that all spread throughout Paris through the night. People leaving here, heading up a couple of kilometres to the Champs-Élysées. But anywhere you went in Paris last night, people shouting from windows, waving flags, mopeds going through the crowds. On the whole, a really joyful outburst in Paris.
Indeed, and it's not just in Paris, even here in Lyon, it was absolute madness in the streets, a really good atmosphere. But there were pockets of violence that we saw also last night. I mean, it was just a few people, but can you tell us the latest on that?
Yes, well, there was certainly some violence, some trouble on the Champs-Élysées. A group of about 30 men attacked a drugstore, apparently to try and steal wine and champagne. There's also reports of a man who's seriously ill in hospital after a brawl near the Champs-Élysées around 9 p.m. And police were having to use water cannon and other crowd control methods at one point. On the whole, given the number of people on the streets, given the problems in the past between people and the police, I think you can say that they were isolated incidents, but obviously serious in themselves.
All right, thank you for that. Live there in Paris, Paul Rees, thanks. And still to come for you on Good Morning Europe, our correspondent Annelise Borges will be with us to discuss her exclusive documentary shot aboard the migrant ship Aquarius when it became the symbol of Europe's migrant crisis last month. And over in the queue,
we have more on those riots and the looting after France's World Cup win. But first, let's take a short break.
Welcome back to Good Morning Europe. Thank you for joining us. Now, in the latest twist in Europe's migrant crisis, despite toughening its stance to stem the flow of people, the Italian government has said it will allow 450 rescued migrants to disembark in Sicily. Our reporter Annelise Borges found herself at the heart of the crisis when she spent 10 days on board the Aquarius rescue ship last month and has made a documentary about the rescue. Well, she joins me in the studio, and in a moment we will also speak to Claudio Lavanga in Rome with more on the Italian response to the crisis, and to Brian Carter in Brussels. But first, let's take a look at this clip from the documentary, 10 Days at Sea, the real story of the Aquarius. It's premiering tonight on Euronews at 9 p.m. CET. Let's take a look.
Our lifeboat heads back again, but there's a new problem. One of the migrants' rafts is now leaking.
Not good condition.
The migrants are now starting to panic. Once again, the lifeboat has to back off.
Back up.
Max can see that the side of the raft is giving way. Several people have fallen in. In the pitch black, it's impossible to see how many people are in the water.
Closer. Moving in.
Once again, there's a risk our lifeboat could be overturned. We're forced to back away from desperate, drowning people. The rescuers are doing their best to keep control of the situation.
Well, Annelise is joining me live in the studio. And Annelise, those were powerful images. We were following all your reports, obviously, from the Aquarius. And you got to hear a lot of different stories, clearly. And it was really a real mix of people on board, wasn't it?
Absolutely, and that's precisely what makes this story so complicated. Migration is a very divisive topic. It's a very complicated story here in Europe. People have different stories with different experiences. What we try to do, Tesa, was to focus on the human stories, because ultimately those crossing borders, those risking their lives in the Mediterranean Sea, are people just like you and me, and that's what we try to focus on. We met several people on board. We spoke to them, we heard their stories, and we tried to show the viewers at home that we were talking about human beings, right? For example, the story of Reward Oko, a 20-year-old from Nigeria who was told by smugglers back in Nigeria that his journey to Europe was going to take him 3 months. He's been on the road for 3 years now. Your trip didn't go as planned.
Yeah, it didn't go as planned.
You spent some time in Libya. How was that?
The life there, I don't sure I can survive a day. I was like shooting every time. Even in the workshop, I was working out. Threatening of guns, like, if you don't do this, you'll be shot. Like, threatening was severe day in and day out. The prevention is better than cure. I rather secure my future when I'm still able and strong enough to do it than when I'm old and feel dizzy to do it. I have to take it straight.
Now, he's been through a very difficult journey, and as you say, it is about the human stories. But also what's interesting when you say that it is a mix of people, I think, politically, because you have, migrants or refugees, and I think ultimately that's where countries are now going to have to decide. Do you know where they are now and what happened to them?
Well, some of them have actually reached out. Reward is one of them. He's currently in Bilbao. He's taking Spanish lessons, and he's waiting to hear on his application. The vast majority of these people are being accompanied by organizations like Caritas or the Spanish Refugee Assistance Committee. But, I mean, ultimately it's going to take some time for them to actually learn whether or not they will be able to stay in Europe, whether or not they will be given a real chance to start a new life in Europe. 78 of the 630 migrants who were rescued by Aquarius that weekend are actually here in France right now.
All right, so they were waiting for their asylum request. Is that what
Absolutely.
You're saying? All right, thank you for that. Annelise Borges, for joining us in the studio to tell us all about your experience. Now, let's hear from Claudio, who is going to tell us about the Italian position, because it has developed since the Aquarius rescue. Claudio, good to see you there. Of course, today we know that the Italian government today is allowing 450 migrants to dock in Sicily, but this came after other countries had agreed to take, to share the burden. Does this mean a softening of their position?
Well, that's quite the contrary. It seems like Italy is hardening its position on migrants. Think about it. They only allowed, as you said, for the 450 migrants to land in Sicily only after several countries agreed to take them in, and after leaving them stranded out at sea in plain sight of the coast for several days now. And they only allowed them to land in Sicily after France, Malta, Germany, Spain and Portugal accepted the request to take 50 migrants each in. Well, now, how has this escalated? It seems like that Italy is playing this game of chess with the European Union, in which migrants are used as pawns, and it is hardening its position, Tesa was saying earlier, because earlier, a couple of weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, it started by closing down the ports only to search and rescue vessels run by ONGs, as of course the first one was the Aquarius, on which Annelise was on. But then, now, these 450 migrants were on board of two vessels. One was run by the Italian tax police, and the other one was run by Frontex, the EU border agency. So the real question here is, how far can Italy go and before it is accused of a breach of human rights, Tesa?
All right, thank you for that update, Claudio Lavanga, for the moment. Now let's go to Brussels, where Brian Carter is standing by. Brian, Italy, as Claudio was saying, is toughening its stand, and it's at the core of it is still sharing the burden. Has there been any resolution or change in policy since all of this unfolded?
Absolutely, Tessa. If you remember, the Aquarius was really a big wake-up call for the EU. It forced the migration debate back onto the agenda. There was a so-called mini-summit that was organized here in the Commission behind me about migration. And then a few days later, there was an EU Council where migration was at the top of the agenda. The overwhelming consensus is to reinforce the external borders and to treat migration as a security issue. But on the other hand, it also made it much harder since Aquarius for NGOs to to operate. An important development came a few days ago when Libya opened its own Maritime Rescue Coordination Center, also known as MRCC. In effect, that means that Libya is now assuming responsibility for its own search and rescue zone in international waters in the Mediterranean, where most of the drownings happen. And that puts NGOs in a tough dilemma, because on the one hand, the law says that they have to obey the MRCC of Libya, including on where to disembark the migrants. On the other hand, Libya is not considered a safe place, and disembarking migrants there could go against the principle of non-refoulement, which says that you cannot bring asylum seekers back to a country where they face persecution. So there's a big gray zone at the moment, and that's why ships like the Aquarius are currently docked in Marseille or in other harbors, waiting to see if the legal situation will clarify in the next few days. The EU tried to find a sort of halfway solution to this by proposing these disembarkation platforms in North African countries. The problem is that not a single North African country has yet agreed to host these disembarkation platforms. So in the words of the European Commission, the situation at the moment is anything but clear.
All right, thank you for that. Brian Carter there in Brussels. Thanks. Now, 10 days at sea, the real story of the Aquarius will premiere tonight only on Euronews at 9 p.m. CET, so make sure to catch that. Now, we'll have a lot more coming out your way, including more on that historic summit between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. And, of course, a lot more on the celebrations in France, plus what's trending online as well. And as the Thai boys get ready to be released from the hospital today, or within this week, we talked to a diver who was instrumental in that rescue mission. But first, we'll leave you with today's no comment from France, of course, with more celebrations which lasted into the night.
On est les champions.
You're watching Good Morning Europe. Our top stories: friends or foes? Donald Trump calls the EU a foe of the US, even putting it before traditional rivals Russia and China. Watching with unease, Trump's comment comes ahead of his first official summit with Vladimir Putin, a meeting that's making allies nervous. And the champions of the world. Wild celebrations in the streets of France as the team bring home a second World Cup title. Our top story this hour: all eyes are on U.S. President Donald Trump as he rounds off his European tour in Helsinki with a highly anticipated U.S.-Russia summit. Well, this morning, the Kremlin has reportedly expressed concern over U.S. criticism of Russia's Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline. Russia's RIA news agency also quoted spokesman Dmitry Peskov as saying discussions on Syria would be difficult due to America's stance on Iran, an ally of Moscow. While no one knows exactly what Trump will discuss with his Russian counterpart, what is certain is that the trip so far has not been without controversy. In a CBS interview ahead of the summit, Trump indicated that the European Union might be public enemy number one, well, at least as far as trade is concerned.
Well, I think we have a lot of foes. I think the European Union is a foe, what they do to us in trade. Now, you wouldn't think of the European Union, but they're a foe. Russia's a foe in certain respects. China's a foe economically, certainly. They're a foe. But that doesn't mean they're bad. It doesn't mean anything. It means that they're competitors.
So will this summit, the first for the Trump administration, actually be a geopolitical win for Russia? For more on this, I'm joined by Jason Bush, a senior analyst at Eurasia Group in London. Jason, thanks for joining us on the program today. You know, both Russia and the United States, they've set the bar very low for this summit. What can we expect then?
Well, I believe that what they've said is generally speaking, true. We shouldn't have high expectations of this summit. The truth is that we're not really in the position at the moment to reach concrete agreements. The most that can be expected from this summit is that it will be the beginning of a process that could potentially lead in future to agreements, the only way you'll reach any concrete agreements is by first discussing them. And one of the problems in US-Russia relations is that there has been very little dialogue, very little contact between the two sides. So in practice, the most concrete results of this summit will simply be to begin that process of dialogue. But in order for that to deliver any concrete achievements, these discussions have to lead somewhere. And it's still far too early to say that that will be the case. We won't see the results of that for several months to come.
You know, Jason, when Trump was here in Brussels, in Brussels or in the UK, he was very, very tough on trying to get what he wants. Do you think this tone will continue with Vladimir Putin?
Well, it may well be the case that in private, Trump will spell out what he wants. It is true that Trump is a negotiator. There has been a lot of speculation in recent weeks about concessions that Trump may make. He's talked about bringing Russia back into the G8. He's even talked in private, reportedly, about recognizing Russia's annexation of Crimea. But I would emphasize that there's very little likelihood that anything like that would be agreed at this summit. These would simply be carrots that could potentially be dangled in front of Putin. But in order for something like that to happen, Putin would have to give something in return. And this isn't something that's going to happen quickly, if at all. And therefore, I don't think people should be worried about Trump making dramatic concessions that would cause massive embarrassment.
Yeah, Jason,
some concern.
I'd like to follow up on that point very quickly. Do you think he is going to make those agreements with Putin, that's going to make his allies really very upset and nervous about it?
Well, he's not going to make those agreements. That's what I was just saying. I don't think there's a realistic prospect that any agreements will come out of this summit. And as far as something like, well, bringing Russia back into the G8, that's not Trump's decision to make. That requires other countries in the G8 to agree. And likewise with Crimea, it's, I think, extremely unrealistic that Trump himself could change that. You have to bear in mind that the entire US foreign policy establishment has a set position on this. And it's unlikely that Trump, whatever his private feelings, will be able to overcome that. So I think concerns.
Yeah, so those watching probably shouldn't be that nervous. Thank you very much for your analysis there. Jason Bush, Senior Analyst at Eurasia in London. Thank you. The European Council President Donald Tusk says the United States and Russia have a duty not to start trade wars. Speaking at the annual EU meeting with China, he called on the three countries to reform the World Trade Organization. Tusk and European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker are in Beijing to meet Chinese Premier Li Keqiang. The leaders are looking to fend off possibilities of an anti-US alliance as China seeks a European counterbalance to US tariffs. There are fears a huge iceberg that has drifted close to a tiny village in western Greenland could split and create massive waves that would swamp homes. A danger zone close to the coast has been evacuated and 170 residents have been moved further up a steep slope where the village lies. Now, Novak Djokovic has won his fourth Wimbledon championship with a straight sets victory over 8th seed Kevin Anderson. The 31-year-old Serb, who's ranked 12th in the world, strolled to victory 6-2, 6-2, 7-6 with a 3-point tiebreaker in the final set. Sunday's win gives Djokovic his 13th Grand Slam title and ends a 25-month barren run. Well, while there were a lot of images of celebration in France, of course, because of their second World Cup win, there were also some images of violence. Alex has been looking into this part of the story, Alex.
I mean, Tessa, the streets were mad, weren't they? Certainly in Lyon. We didn't get much sleep last night. France was coming alive last night, celebrating this World Cup win. But in amongst the joy, in amongst the celebrations, were pockets of looting, pockets of violence as well, including this video from Paris, which shows a gang. It's been verified by the Storyful news agency. It shows a gang kicking in the windows of a scooter shop and breaking into this property. Now, you can see them here. in amongst the celebrations, perhaps using that as a guise to smash in the glass to gain entry to this premises. But it wasn't just in, well, it was in Paris, perhaps the epicenter, you could say, but there were reports of this type of activity across France. In Paris itself, police fired tear gas at people on the Champs-Élysées, and this journalist, Joy Reid, was caught up in it. You can have a look at her face, this image she posted saying, encountered unexpected tear gas on the way back to the hotel. That stuff burns. This is the reaction that she had to it. So the fact that the French police were deploying this in amongst those crowds to try and disperse these violent elements perhaps shows you some of what they were up against. In Bordeaux, a car set alight in the middle of the street. Now, we saw a lot of people dancing around cars in a lot of the videos, but here, somebody has gone the extra step and set a vehicle alight. And you can see almost the crowd sort of perhaps stunned into silence around this. But this in the centre of the French streets. This is the kind of thing the emergency services were having to deal with in addition to obviously all the joy and all the crowd control they were doing there as well. But perhaps a little disturbing element. Simon Louvet, a journalist, reported that he and a colleague were attacked because they were journalists. They were singled out from the crowd, and he says his colleague received several blows to the face. His colleague, Julien Bouteiller, later tweeted that leaving the hospital he was fine but a bit groggy. So in amongst all that celebration, it's important not to let these kind of elements swamp it or dwarf it, but there were some nasty, violent elements last night, police and emergency services having to tackle them as well. So a World Cup win for France, but for some people, it was a bit of a tricky night.
But then, as you say, you know, overall, at least it's a good thing that these were just minor incidents, well, small compared to the celebrations. Thank you for that, Alex, in the Cube. And still to come for you on Good Morning Europe, we will be speaking to one of the divers who took part in the rescue of the 12 boys and their coach from the cave in Thailand. That's after a short break. Welcome back to Good Morning Europe. Your top story, U.S. President Donald Trump calls the EU a foe before also listing China and Russia as enemies. This comes ahead of Trump's first summit with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Both sides say they have low expectations. Now, it's been a tumultuous 7 days for British Prime Minister Theresa May, and now she's capped it off by telling Brexiteers within her government to support her plans or, quote, risk no Brexit at all. The comments come in the wake of the first official visit to the UK by President Trump, where he publicly criticized her strategy, and May saw resignations within her own cabinet. In another blow to the Prime Minister, a former minister publicly lambasted May's plan and called for a rerun of the Brexit referendum. And joining us live from London is your news correspondent, Vincent McAviney. I mean, Vincent, clearly things are still difficult for Theresa May. Is there any likelihood that things will settle quite soon for her?
Good morning, Tessa. Well, Theresa May is probably waking up this morning relieved that President Trump's visit is over, but obviously keeping an eye on what he now says in Helsinki. She herself, though, is facing an incredibly difficult week as she fights for her Brexit proposals. Yesterday, in an interview, she did reveal the unique advice that President Trump had given to her. Let's have a listen.
I should sue the EU.
Sue the EU?
Sue the EU. Not go into negotiations, sue them. Actually, no. We're going into negotiations with them. But interestingly, what the president also said at that press conference was don't walk away.
Yeah.
Don't walk away from the negotiations because then you're stuck.
Well, on the Brexiteer side, Theresa May does seem to be facing a coordinated effort. There's a rumour of a WhatsApp group with around 100 MPs in it, and this drip attack on her. Last night, Robert Courts, an MP who is a junior ministerial aide in the Foreign Office, resigned from his position, saying that he had to think of who he would see in the mirror for the rest of his life. And on the Remain side, Justine Greening, the former education minister who quit Theresa May's government a couple of months ago, has called for a second referendum. But really now, all eyes are on what Boris Johnson does. He and David Davis both need to make resignation speeches in the House of Commons, but Boris is the critical one. He hasn't said anything for the past week, but Donald Trump has 3 times publicly endorsed him to be a good Prime Minister, even in front of Theresa May on Friday. Now, he's written for The Telegraph this morning saying that people need to believe in Brexit. But when he stands in the Commons, this could be a critical moment. And in the final days of of Margaret Thatcher's premiership. Geoffrey Howe, her deputy prime minister, resigned and gave a speech criticising her on Europe, saying that she had scuppered her own team. We'll see whether Boris Johnson will be giving that kind of oratory in the House of Commons, which could lead to him really challenging Theresa May and possibly replacing her as prime minister.
We'll see indeed. Thank you for that, Vincent McAveney there in London. Thanks. Now, 12 boys rescued from a flooded cave in Thailand have paid tribute to a diver who died during the rescue mission. The Wild Boars football team and their coach were brought out of the Tam Luang cave last Tuesday after 17 days trapped underground. Ex-Navy SEAL Saman Gunan lost his life while installing oxygen tanks along the passageways of the cave. After learning of his death, the boys wrote messages on a drawing of Saman, and doctors say they will be discharged from hospital on Thursday. Ivan Karadzic was part of the international team of cave diving experts who helped in the 3-day rescue operation, and he's joining me now from Koh Tao in Thailand. Thank you very much for joining us today on the program. I think what we all want to know is what was it like inside that cave, and what was the biggest challenge for you?
Well, I think that the biggest challenge for myself and for the rest of the rescue team was obviously that we were dealing with kids that are not trained for this kind of diving. That was a big challenge, and there was also some physically hard areas of the cave, walking and climbing, that was very challenging.
Yeah. So in hindsight, now when you look back at it, did you expect it to be much worse than it actually was now?
To be honest, I didn't have much expectation. I've never participated in cave rescue before. I've done recovery mission, not in caves, but in the ocean. So to be honest, I know I didn't have much forewarning of what we should expect up there. But I would definitely not categorize anything that happened up there as easy. No, not at all.
Right, and from a very technical point of view, was there something that you learned out of this, took out from this, which you could apply in other situations?
I'm sure that I have more experience now with rescue, and hopefully I will never have to use those skills. But yes, I'm sure I've learned a lot from both techniques and.
Yeah, and just very briefly,
yeah.
I would like to ask you, how do you feel the fact that it ended quite well, actually?
Well, I'm incredibly relieved that we came out, and it was almost 100% success, as you mentioned yourself. Unfortunately, we did lose a member of our team, and that's hard to acknowledge. But I think with the odds that we are facing and the outcome, I still consider it a positive outcome, even with a loss of human life.
Indeed, that sad part of that rescue there. But thank you very much, Ivan Karadzic, part of the international team of cave diving experts there. Thank you. And still to come for you on the program, the French people celebrate their team's second World Cup title. We'll have all the reactions online, of course, with our social media team. Welcome back to Good Morning Europe. Of course, if you didn't know, but the big news in France is that they're the World Cup champions, and there were celebrations across the country. Alex has been keeping up to date with all the reactions. Alex.
Yeah, in case you missed it, this isn't for those of us living in France, because we didn't miss it last night. It was a rather short night in terms of sleep, but a big night in terms of celebrations for France. But France are the champions of the world, and look at the French trends on Twitter this morning. I want to bring these up for you. So during the tournament, we had Allez les Bleus. Go the Blues. And here now we have Merci les Bleus. And here, Champion du Monde, world champions. These are France's top trends that the country is waking up to today. And an awful lot of people talking about this 19-year-old Mbappe kissing the trophy here. People seeing him as a symbol of hope, inspiration to young people. And also pointing out that he's donating a huge amount of his earnings to good causes off this World Cup. Many people seeing him as a hero. So much so, they are spraying onto the pavements. We can look at this little twist on the famous phrase, Liberté, Égalité, Mbappé, which is you've seen on T-shirts, flags, and now sprayed onto pavements as well. So how did the French president respond to this win? Well, in an understated manner, as you can imagine. This is Macron in Russia, enjoying himself, celebrating. Perhaps that's the mood that the entire country was feeling as Griezmann here projected. This is a huge crowd on the Champs-Élysées, live pictures, the whole world media covering this. France, the world champions, and are they going to enjoy that well into today? Were you there? What are your thoughts? You can let us know using #TheQ.
You were there.
Thank
you for that, Alex, and thank you for joining us on Good Morning Europe. And do stay with your news for all of your top stories. In the meantime, because we can't get enough of all these images, we'll leave you with today's no comment from Paris, where there were all-night celebrations as France, as you know, became World Cup winners for the second time.